Welcome, this is Jim, host of the Faith Influencer podcast, where we're going to dive into discussions on faith's role in everyday life, from navigating blended families to overcoming challenges. I'm a husband, a father, a Bible teacher, an advocate for applying faith to everyday life. So tune in as I share personal stories, valuable insights, and practical wisdom. Welcome to Faith Influencer. This is Jim Cunningham, excited to jump in our subject today. This was one of those that was brought up to me when I was doing a conference and someone asked me to address this. And so I'm going to address it. And it is the role of grandparents in blended families. Now, maybe you haven't thought about the role of grandparents. I'm going to say it's a forgotten role in blended families. I'm going to suggest maybe it's a secret ingredient to having a successful blended family. Now, there are two sides to this. There is the positive side of grandparents in blended families, and there's the negative side of grandparents in blended families. And we're going to cover both of those today. So let's jump right in and get started. It is true that in blended families, there is this dance that everybody's doing to try to figure this thing out. As we're trying to figure out how to best form our blended family, there is the grandparents who can step in and be so beneficial. And I want to give you some of those ways they can contribute without overstepping. So let's get started. And probably the most obvious one where grandparents can contribute to a blended family is just to have a supportive presence in the family. So we all know that grandparents are special. Most families, they just have this special role that they play. Grandkids love their grandparents. They call them by different names. I don't know what you call yours. In my family, we always called my grandmother Granny. She was always Granny. And all of the grandfathers were Pawpaw. Everybody has their own tradition. But they always play this special role. I mean, for grandkids, there's just something about grandma that's unlike anything else. And my kids feel the same way about my parents. It's just something special. Well, that grandparent, if maybe you have this conversation with them, can play such a supportive role to your blended family. I mean, no one's more patient. Normally, there's the other side we'll cover in a minute, but normally no one's more patient than grandparents. I mean, think about it. Most grandparents in my mind are retired and they have plenty of time to listen. I know my kids will go to my parents' house, their grandparents, and they'll just go on their own, drive over there, sit down, now that they're older, and just have a talk with Granny. Just tell her what's going on with school and maybe some of their issues because grandma's so patient. So that is a great role for a grandparent in a blended family, just to provide that supportive presence. And you might need to invite that with your parents and ask them to be more intentional about that. So that's one. Also, they can be great mediators. Sometimes they have more of an outside view, and they can see things going on in the family, and they can give you some unbiased advice that maybe you need. They can help mediate conflicts at different times. Maybe it's a safe space that you can go and vent. So sometimes grandparents play that role of mediator. Here's one, though, that's very dear to my heart. This is really important to me. And I think maybe I've wondered why this is so important to me. And I think maybe it's because it's something in my family that's been passed down, and it is the cultural and family heritage role that grandparents can play. I mean, they're like the keepers of the history of the family. The family history is important to me. It's not important to everybody, but it's important to me, but it plays a role in a blended family. So think about this. Think about when you've brought two families together, and now this grandparent has step-grandchildren. And the step-grandchildren all have this reverence for grandparents. And if that grandparent brings them in just like their biological stepchildren, it means so much to them. But how can they do that? Include them in the family history. Now, let me tell you why I say that. And let me tell you that I'm not just saying that. This is how important it is to me. This is what I did recently. I loaded up my family And I have a couple of grandkids, and in my personal family, my children, as you know, I have a blended family. So I have my son and my stepson. They were on this trip, and we went to the town of my family. Outside of that little town, there is this cemetery, Greenwood Cemetery. And inside of that cemetery are the graves of all of my family, all the way back to the early 1800s. So I had grandson, my stepson, my wife, and we're walking to the different sites of my family. And as we stood there, I told them some stories about their grandparents or step-grandparents, but included them all in this. I told them fun stories that they could remember. I told them the full names of their grandparents or step-grandparent, but I included all of them. I would say to them, this is your great-grandfather, and his name is Joseph King. And I would tell a story about him, a true story about him. This is your grandmother. We called her Grandma Nellie. And I would tell a story about them. But here's what that does. This is why I'm telling you this story. Because when you bring them into the history of your family, it creates a special bond. And for the stepchildren or the step-grandchildren, it helps them feel a family identity. So I want to encourage you, as one of the things where your grandparents or the grandparents can play a role in your blended family, is to ask them to help be the keeper of the family history. Pass down those stories, talk about those stories, and tell them to everyone and make them feel included. Well, let's keep moving. Role models is another one. Role model is the positive behavior that a grandparent can play. Now, you would hope that after all these years, and now they've reached the point of retirement, that grandparents maybe are a little more patient, a little more kind. Not always the case, but hopefully you would think so. And it's that kind of behavior, how they react to stress. It is those relationships that grandparents, where they can serve their grandchildren and step-grandchildren just as role models. I'm sort of biased, but let me say something about my mother. My mother is the greatest Christian I know. And my children and stepchildren all look up to her. Everybody calls her Granny. I even call her Granny now. I don't call her Mom. I call her Granny. Whatever. So we look at her, and she has just this endearing way about her that she's become this role model as what a Christian is. Now, here's what happens. Now, all of us, including my children, grandchildren, including her step-grandchildren, they all call her when they're having an event or an issue or a test or something, and they want Granny to pray. They all call Granny. Granny needs you to pray about something. And here's what they know. They know that Granny's going to pray about it. And when Granny prays, God listens. Something about grandparents that are a little closer to God, so it seems. So tell your Granny to pray about stuff. So the role model. Grandparents can be that great role model. And let me give you one other thing on the positive side before we jump to the other, is that they can be additional caregivers. Sometimes you just need a date night. Maybe you're calling mom and say, hey, can you come over and stay with the kids for a while? They can provide that role. They can assist in childcare. Don't push them or don't do the guilt thing with them, but allow them to play that role. Now, in all of that, I want to say this. I want you to consider being intentional about involving your parents, your kids' grandparents, or step-grandparents. I want you to consider being intentional about involving them in your family. The role that they can play can be so cohesive to what you're trying to accomplish in your blended family. That's tough in the first place, the blended family. So there is perhaps a secret ingredient that you haven't thought about in your blended family. So I love that. That's the role that mine play in my family, but I know that's not the case for all of them. So the second part of this, let's talk about the boundaries for grandparents in blended families, the boundaries. There has to be some boundaries. Sometimes Granny just needs to mind her own business, right? Sometimes Granny is stepping over the bounds. Sometimes Grandma doesn't know when to not say something. That's the other side of it. Sometimes grandparents reach the point where they've watched their tone and they've watched their attitudes for so long. Now anything goes. Now they'll say whatever. Doesn't matter. They just feel they've earned the right to be rude. They've earned the right to use whatever language they want to use. Sometimes that's where grandparents end up. Well, we're going to talk about some boundaries. So let's dive into this piece of it. Boundary number one, I'm going to say, is that grandparents have to respect the parental authority. Grandparents has to honor the rule. They've got to honor the rules that you've placed in your household. Now, it may be a change for them because you've now remarried and you have a blended family, and you and your blended family have decided to set up your own set of rules in your household. Maybe they're different than what they were before. So your parents, the grandparents, they've got to honor the rules of that family. Now, this is what someone said to me recently. They said that their new spouse's mother would come to her son to complain about her new daughter-in-law and how she handles, or in this grandparent's words, doesn't handle the behavior of her children. So she disapproved of how her step-grandchildren were acting. And the way that she dealt with this is that she went to her son in secret to complain about it. What do you think the response of the son should have been when his mother was coming to him in secret to complain about his new wife and her grandma's step-grandchildren? What do you think the son should have done? How do you think he should have handled that? Well, he probably should have said in a nice way, "Mom, mind your own business. Mind your own business. This is our household." And he probably could just create the boundary right then in a kind way. I never want you to be unkind. In a kind way to say, "Mom, when you come to me in secret, I'm not keeping secrets from my, in this case, wife. I'm not gonna keep a secret that you're coming to me in secret and complaining about things. I'm not gonna create that division in my new marriage of secrets. And you and I have our own little talk over here, and we talk about my new wife and her children. We're not going to do that in this family." Maybe you just need to lay it down, show mom the boundary, and start there. So grandparents have to respect parental authority. Here's the next one. This is the big one. Maybe this is the most frustrating of all. In a blended family, grandparents, they have to avoid favoritism. They can't show favoritism. So here's the complaint that I get. And some of you who are listening right now, I promise you that you have gone through this. It is where grandma shows favoritism towards her biological grandchildren over her step-grandchildren. How does she do this? Well, maybe she calls her biological grandchildren and not her step-grandchildren. Maybe she invites her biological grandchildren over, or maybe she'll come by and say to her biological grandchildren, "Hey, let's go to get some ice cream," but she doesn't include her step-grandchildren. Absolutely can't happen. I'm not saying that she can't have a relationship with her biological grandchildren. And maybe they're older and she's had this relationship now ongoing for a long time. So they have a special relationship. I'm not saying you undo that at all. They still have that relationship. I'm not saying they can't spend time together, just the two of them. But grandma, if you're going to spend time with your biological grandchildren or grandchild, just you and that person, well, make time to do that with the step-grandchild as well. And be sure to call and invite them to things, or be sure to sit down and ask them how their day's going, or how's class going, or how's football going, or whatever it might be. You can't exclude them. I told this story in a previous podcast several months ago, And I love the way the lady handled it, but she was remarrying, and she and her two children were remarrying a man who had three children, and they had purchased a house together, and they were getting ready to move in. And her mother came because she adored her biological grandchildren, which is fine. Her mother, or let's just say grandma, came and said, "You make sure your kids get good rooms." That's what Granny said. Now, that's stepping over the boundaries. But here's what her daughter said, who handled it perfect. She said to her mother, she said, "Mom, they're all my children." That was a great answer. And what that did is just in a quick way set a boundary for grandma that we're not dividing up these kids. Now we're all together, one family. They're all my kids. And what she was really saying is to her mother, "Grandmother, these are all your grandchildren. They're all your grandchildren." So avoid favoritism. When you show favoritism, that's going to create feelings of exclusion, pretty unkind. That's going to create feelings of resentment. All of that's going to build up as you show favoritism. So you can't show favoritism. You have to be intentional with all of the grandchildren. And again, parent, mom and dad, you may have to go talk to your parents, the grandparents, if you sense this going on. Maybe they don't even catch they're doing this, but you may have to go and have this conversation with them so that they include everybody in the family and we don't exclude anyone. That's a big one. Here's another one. Maintain privacy. Maintain privacy. Now, this is really what I'm saying. Don't meddle in their business. Don't meddle in their business. Their family has personal matters, and I know it's a new family, and you're wanting to know what's going on. But here's one of the other traits of grandmothers, especially. I'm not leaving grandpas out, but grandmothers especially. Sometimes grandmothers has this spiritual gift called nosiness. They just want to be nosy. They just want to butt in and know what's going on over there. They just want to know that their biological grandchildren are being treated good. They want to know that there's not an advantage going to the step grandchildren. They just want to butt in and be nosy. You got to maintain privacy in your household. It's not their household. It's not your parents' household. It's not the grandparents' household. Unless they're invited in on the conversation, that may be a boundary that you need to set. Don't be so nosy. Here's another one. Open communication. That's an important one. Clear and open communication with both sets of parents can prevent some of these issues happening. Now, I always like to give you some suggestions, and here's one of them. If you have a new blended family, maybe you, husband and wife, need to sit down and have a conversation about the role that you want your parents, the grandparents, to play in this blended family. I've already said there's a wonderful place, a wonderful role that they can play. But you may need to talk about how you're going to handle some of the things. And sometimes you may say, well, my mother can be a little this way, and I want you to know about that. Well, maybe you need to have those conversations. I had a funny one the other day. Someone said to me, in this case, they said, we're very conservative in our family. We have a strong Christian family. We're conservative in our beliefs. We're conservative in our politics. And then the wife said, this was a new blended family. Then the wife said, but my mother is so liberal, and she will tell you all day long about how you're wrong in your conservative beliefs. And I said, so what'd you do? Well, she said, well, first of all, I warned my husband that this was coming because he was very conservative, and he wore one of those hats that she knew her mother was going to flip her wig when she saw this hat. So the husband said, too bad, I'm still going to wear it. So what do? Well, maybe the daughter needs to go to her mother and say, Mama, stay out of our business. He's going to wear this hat, and you're not going to say anything. So you may need to run interference so you don't have some of these big conflicts. The worst thing I can imagine in that scenario is for grandma to come over the house. The grandkids are there, the step grandkids are there, and he's wearing his hat, and grandma has to say something about it. And then they get into this big political fight over conservative and liberal, and all of that takes place. Listen, grandma can do that at her house, but she can't do that at your house. So you have to maintain some privacy. And the way you do that is open communication about what's allowed and what's not allowed in your house. Which goes to this, to the next thing. You've got to be open-minded and be willing to adapt to some new structures. And so that's all I'm saying there. Let me give you one last thing. Boundary awareness. Maybe there needs to be some emotional boundaries as well as physical boundaries. Maybe it needs to be something like this. Maybe that you're remarried and you have your blended family, and your dad, grandpa, loves to have fun and he loves to kid, but sometimes his teasing is a little out of bounds. And maybe you've remarried and your new spouse says to you, my son is a little sensitive about this particular area, and I'm letting you know, don't tease him in this area because he might smile, but it's going to hurt him deeply and he doesn't take it very well. So you may have to communicate with your father, grandpa in this case. You may have to communicate with him that there is an emotional boundary here, and you can't tease him about that. Everybody seems to want to, but you can't tease him about that. So you may have to communicate that as well to be able to maintain some harmony. So these are just some ideas for grandparents. I hope that you're intentional with your grandparents. I love grandparents. They can play a great role, but they can also step over the boundary if you're not really clear as to what those boundaries are. So be intentional, invite them into your life, give them some boundaries, and let that be a secret ingredient to your blended family. Thanks again for joining us. And I hope that you like, share, and subscribe what we're doing here. Go on to YouTube and listen to the TikTok versions of what we're doing as well. We're trying to reach the world for blended families and creating a different statistic for them. So your help is very appreciated. Thank you.